We only have 20 minutes. I'm expecting lots of questions as well, please, and hope to have a great conversation as well. Before we start, many of you, I'm sure, have seen this wonderful photo. Many thanks firstly to Gerald Knight for sharing the story behind this photo. On the right, you will see, of course, hand of the cause Ruhiya Khanum. On the left, you will see UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar. He was a Peruvian diplomat and the fifth UN Secretary General. And this was in 1985, Ruhiya Khanum presenting a copy of the Promise of World Peace to the UN Secretary General on the 38th floor of the UN Secretariat, the UN. It was the first time a Baha'i representative had met with a UN Secretary General, and they had a conversation for around 25 minutes around the key themes of that message as well. So a historic moment, of course. To explore peace and to understand peace and how it applies to the work of the United Nations, there are a number of theories that can help us understand how peace is instituted at the level of the United Nations. Of course, the key document is the founding document of the UN itself, the UN Charter, which is an incredible document in itself in the 1940s, which says to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's how that document opens. And of course, in the 80 years, and by the way, it's 80 years next month that the UN was founded, many questions have been asked of this exact question and the efficacy of that organization, that United Nations organization. There are two key theories to understand when it comes to understanding peace at the level of the UN. The first one is known as the liberal peace. It's been called the liberal peace by academics and practitioners. And what the liberal peace essentially is and argues is that democratization, human rights, the rule of law, winner takes all elections, and a free market economic programs act as a panacea for peace in both conflict and post-conflict settings. So it's the basic understanding of liberalism in international relations, that democratization, free and fair elections, rule of law, economic strengthening can lead to peace in both conflict and post-conflict settings around the globe. This is the understanding. This is the framework that the UN still to this day approaches the question of peace. It's very important to understand because it has implications for peacekeeping, peace processes, peacemaking, how peace is understood and how it's instituted. There have been many criticisms of the liberal peace, understandably, right? You can turn on the news and you can see it for yourself. Academically, what academics say is that the liberal peace is ineffective. They say it's a top-down elitist approach. They say it's neo-colonialist. What you're doing is exporting Western liberal values onto countries which don't enjoy the same framework as you do, right? They say it needs updating, right? It's not context or conflict sensitive. You can't go to Yemen and say, listen, for example, hold free and fair elections and, the outcome will be peace, for example, right? It's a deeply contested term, and peace is a deeply contested term. The second one is the idea that Max mentioned. He called it a positive and negative peace. And this comes from a Norwegian sociologist known as Johan Galtung, who argued that negative peace was this perennially simplified view that negative peace is simply the end of war. The guns go silent, a ceasefire agreement, for example. He said positive peace is way more complex, and I'll read his own language here. He says positive peace is the absence of structural violence, i.e., the economic and political conditions found in social structures that perpetually contribute to violence, injustice, and inequality, or the lack of access to basic social services, thereby contributing to poor health, death, or the repression of individuals within a society. So it's looking at the drivers of conflict, the drivers of structural violence that lead to war. It's a way more holistic way of viewing the question of peace. Not simply, this is very important, not simply the absence of war. We can't imagine that when the guns go silent after a ceasefire agreement, a country or a region or the world has achieved peace. For example, it's way more complex than that. And this has, again, implications for the work that we do. The Universal House of Justice tells us in that 18th of January 2019 message, when defining peace, they say these forces, and they talk about the forces of the world wars, which lead to the Paris Peace Conference, which lead to the League of Nations, which lead to the UN. They say these forces have continued to move humanity towards an age of peace, not merely a peace which rules out armed conflict, but a collective state of being manifesting unity. If Galtung, that Norwegian sociologist, looked at this, I'm sure he would have nodded his head and said, yes, interesting, right? It's not just merely a peace which rules out armed conflict, but a collective state of being manifesting unity. This principle, of course, as we know, of unity comes up time and time again when we talk about the principle of peace or the idea of peace. When we define peace, the tablets at The Hague, those two incredible tablets from Abdul Baha that he addresses to the organization in The Hague, he defines in the second tablet war and he defines peace. And I think you could write essays on just these terminologies themselves. He says, war is destruction, while universal peace is construction. War is death, while peace is life. War is rapacity and bloodthirstiness, while peace is beneficence and humaneness. War is an appurtenance of the world of nature, while peace is the foundation of the religion of God. War is darkness upon darkness, while peace is heavenly light. War is the destroyer of the edifice of mankind, while peace is the everlasting life of the world of humanity. War is like the devouring wolf, while peace is like the angels of heaven. War is a struggle for existence, while peace is mutual aid and cooperation among the peoples of the world and the cause of the good pleasure of the true one in the heavenly realm. So we could meditate on this passage all day, right? And I think we will have many, many conversations about what is war and what is peace. And as academics, we love to, academics, they love to define words. What does a word mean? What does war mean? What does peace mean? Here it is, right? War is the destroyer of the edifice of mankind. I thought was so interesting, right? What does that mean? What is its implications when we see war, how it destroys? Abdul also in the tablet to The Hague expands our understanding of peace even further. He sets out, of course, in those tablets, the teachings of Baha'u'llah, the principles of Baha'u'llah, the prerequisites of peace. And he says, and he compares it to a table with many different kinds of food. He says, as the teachings of Baha'u'llah are combined with universal peace, they are like a table combined with every fresh and delicious food. Every soul can find at that table of infinite bounty that which he desires. If the question is restricted to universal peace alone, the remarkable results which are expected and desired will not be attained. The scope of universal peace must be such that all the communities and religions may find their highest wish realized in it. The teachings of Baha'u'llah are such that all the communities of the world, whether religious, political, or ethical, ancient, or modern, find in them the expression of their highest wish. So again, coming back to Galton's understanding of how we define peace, do we see peace as simply the end of war? Or do we see peace as this holistic view that encompasses all the teachings of Baha'u'llah, right? You need all of these teachings, just like that table. And this idea that all the communities and religions may find their highest wishes. It's a beautiful analogy. Anybody from any background can come to that table and see and find something that they resonate strongly with, right? It's beautiful, it's holistic, it's dynamic, right? Okay, so this brings us to how does the UN both understand, conceptualize, and practice peace. So there's a seminal document from 1992. There are many documents that the UN produces, thousands, millions. But the 1992 Agenda for Peace document from the UN Secretary General of the time clearly outlined three ways in which the UN institutes peace globally. One is peacekeeping, peace building, peacemaking. We'll look at peacemaking a little bit more for this, but peacemaking we know as the blue helmets. You would have seen this on the news many times. Yes, that they go into both conflict settings, usually at the early stage of a conflict, to police a ceasefire. They go in with the consent of the country. This is very important. So the UN is made up of 193 governments, right? That's the UN, that's the United Nations. And the UN does not move a muscle if it's not with the consent of that actual country and the authorities in place. This is very important. So one of the principles of peacekeeping is that they come in with the consent of the country itself. They are impartial. They are made up of armies and contributions from all over the world, whether Mongolia, India. You will go to, for example, South Sudan, for example, and you will see a peacekeeping mission, and you will find peacekeepers from all over the world, right? And it's largely ineffective. Data has showed actually peacekeeping is largely an effective tool in keeping the peace. Galton will call this a negative peace, though. It's a temporary peace. Okay, it's not a positive or a long-term peace. Peace building focuses on the drivers of conflict itself. It's about working with national authorities to prevent a relapse into conflict, usually in post-conflict settings. So a country has had decades and decades of war, for example, and the UN will work with national authorities, various ministries, for example, to build, to strengthen measures, for example, including the rule of law, democratic governance, the role of women in governance, for example, various activities. And it's a very kind of a liberal peace model that we talked about, right? It takes into account all of these various elements, and it's focused on a more long-term peace. Peacemaking is the idea of trying to bring conflict parties to the table for dialogue to reach a negotiated settlement to an end of a conflict. It's the idea of at an early stage of a war, it's basically mediation, it's negotiation, it's arbitration. How do you bring these parties to the conflict in the first place? And peacemaking is undertaken by the offices of the UN, usually called UN Special Envoys as well. So what are some of the prevalent discourses that we currently see in peacemaking currently at the level of the UN? Well, like I mentioned in the beginning, the liberal peace has often been criticized as being too top-down a process, too elitist, too out of touch with what's actually happening on the ground. And what we've understood and what the UN has realized is that peace is a dynamic process, and therefore the idea of inclusivity and hybridity is an extremely important part of any peace process globally. What that means is that you cannot, for example, as the UN or any multilateral institution, come into a country and expect to institute peace on your own. We would call it universal participation in peace. Okay? You need the role of civil society, you need women's groups, you need youth. And the UN has learned the hard way. For example, it's tried to come in and, for example, institute peace on its own. You need all of these groups, for example, you need the public, you need the media, you need all of them to work with you, for example, on a peace process. It's not a top-down institutional-led process, right? This is very important. They call it hybridity or inclusivity. We see this, for example, in Yemen, for example, in the UN Special Envoy in Yemen, when he started the mediation process many, many years ago. There's been a number of UN Special Envoys since. He would organize roundtables with civil society, with women's groups, right? Having conversations and this idea of dialogue, right? Peacemaking is literally about dialogue. It's how to get them talking in the first place. These two sides hate each other, right? It's about how do you even get them to start talking in the first place, for example, right? And usually civil society, for example, the Bahá'í International Community, by the way, is civil society, yeah? To the United Nations, it's a civil society group, right? Know the context and the conflict way better than the mediator themselves, usually. You must, from a sense of humility, involve them. Another important discourse to peacemaking is ripeness. So one diplomat once wrote, he says, the peacemaker cannot want peace more than the conflict parties themselves. It's true, right? You can't go in expecting to institute peace and these two don't want peace. They must want it, right? It must come. So what constitutes ripeness, for example? What is a ripe scenario in which you can build peace in a conflict setting? One academic said a mutually hurting stalemate, for example. He called it a mutually hurting stalemate. Right? When they get to a stage on the battlefield where they realize no one is winning here, okay, we must come to the table. It's that driving force of ripeness. Okay. What we're also seeing in the peacemaking landscape at the moment is that it's a very crowded landscape. Unfortunately, peacemaking itself are in competition with each other. Right? Just like nations, we can say peacemakers are in competition with each other. Why? Because it looks great. Yeah, it looks amazing in front of the camera, right? You stand there with the flag behind you, right? I'm not mentioning any names, okay? Okay, and you've instituted peace. You look fantastic. It's a lot about optics these days. Yeah, the optics of peacemaking has become a huge element. States, right, are vying with each other. Right? We see this on the news to become peacemakers, to institute peace. And it's not just UN, it's states, it's private companies. Sometimes peacemaking is done privately by a think tank or an NGO because it has to be quietly done, for example. In the UK, we have a few of those such organizations. Of course, any discourse about peacemaking in the UN has to mention the Security Council. Of course we do, yeah? The Security Council is a deeply, deeply divided Security Council across power lines. Yeah, the power of the veto. We know the power of the veto is well known, right? That 5 members hold that power of the veto and they can shut down any operation, right? And it means thousands of tons of humanitarian aid do not go into that particular country, right? Just from a single veto power, for example. We see that IHL is international humanitarian law. We'll hear, I'm sure, more about this. International humanitarian law and the rules of war have come under threat like we've never seen before, right? In Ukraine, in a space of 4 years of war, I was in Ukraine with the WHO. We have recorded over 2,600 attacks on healthcare in 4 years. That means hospitals directly being attacked. You've seen the images on the news, right? IHL has come under threat like we've never, ever seen before, right? And this is shocking, okay? And no statements that we can put out will seemingly stop that thing. And these norms and standards that the UN Charter speaks to are really, really being put under threat. Another aspect, and I haven't included it here, is the UN is facing a existential financial crisis due to a member state pulling out funding, right? So we know that a particular member state has pulled out funding at the beginning of this, and this has really caused the UN and the United Nations system to crash, right? To rethink its structures, to rethink its funding mechanisms. How can we be reliable? So I don't know if we're aware, but the UN is funded by member states, by its countries. The bigger the country, the more you give. Simple as put. Yeah, it's funded in many other ways, but that's largely how it's funded. Now, the process of peacemaking, to go back in terms of what does it do? Does it just come and bring those two sides together and it mediates and it looks good in front of the cameras and everyone goes home and we institute peace? No, it's a little bit more complex than that. We know that. Okay. So the process is not just a cessation of hostilities, but it's about instituting or implementing processes such as democratization through power sharing, the rule of law, human rights, security sector reform, and transitional justice measures, for example. It's a political piece. It's an institutional piece that it's looking at. Yeah, it is a top-down as well. So the promise of world peace sets out a number of, it provides us crystal clear guidance in terms of what are the challenges globally for peace, but also what are the challenges for these institutions like the UN and nation states when it comes to the question of peace as well. It says there is, however, a paralysis of will, and this must be carefully examined and resolutely dealt with. This paralysis is rooted, as we have stated, in a deep-seated conviction of the inevitable quarrelsomeness of mankind, which has led to the reluctance to entertain the possibility of subordinating national self-interest to the requirements of world order, and in an unwillingness to face courageously the far-reaching implications of establishing a united world authority. So this issue of a paralysis of will is heard time and again in the various fora of the UN. It's sometimes called political will. You'll be in meetings and they'll say, look, we know the issue, but we lack political will. And everyone will nod, yes, yes, yes. And you'll hear it again and again and again. And the House of Justice is asking us to carefully examine and resolutely deal with that exact issue, right? As one of the ways to deal. And it says, look, it's one of the ways, it's in this deep-seated conviction of the inevitable quarrelsomeness of mankind, which has led to the reluctance to entertain the possibility of subordinating national self-interest to the requirements of a world order. So 2 things there. So one is this word inevitable is not random. So in international relations theory, there is a key theory known as realism, and realism argues, one of the arguments of realism in international relations argues for the inevitability of conflict, that conflict and war is inevitable. It's become so commonplace in both academia and practice that this word inevitable comes up time and time again. You will hear UN officials use that term inevitable, but it's inevitable, right? It's become common. The inevitable, which has led to the reluctance to entertain the possibility of subordinating national interest to the requirements of a world order. So the key criticism of the United Nations, and the UN Secretary General a few years ago gave an interview and he says, look, we don't have teeth, he says. The UN doesn't have teeth. Right? It can't bite. It doesn't have the legal powers to enforce many of the things that it wants to put in place. Why? Because national authority is here, as in nation states are here, and international organizations are here in terms of power structures, if that makes sense, right? National interest still is number one when it comes to these issues. The abolition of war is also, and this has implications for peacemaking that we have said, it's not simply a matter of signing treaties and protocols. It's a complex task requiring a new level of commitment to resolving issues not customarily associated with the pursuit of peace. Based on political agreements alone, the idea of collective security is a chimera. Is it chimera? Chimera. The other point is that the primary challenge in dealing with issues of peace is to raise the context to the level of principle as distinct from pure pragmatism. For in essence, peace stems from an inner state supported by a spiritual or moral attitude, and it is chiefly in evoking this attitude that the possibility of enduring solutions can be found. So again, it defines peace for us as an inner state supported by spiritual or moral attitude, and it's chiefly in evoking this attitude that the possibility of enduring solutions can be found. So the question, I think a key question is, how do we evoke that inner state, right? How is that possible at both the individual, community, and international level? How do you do that? What's that power that is able to possibly do that? And the idea, and there's a critique there as well. Based on political agreements alone, the idea of collective security is that lovely word. Yeah? 5 minutes. Okay, and it's not about signing of treaties. We cannot expect that the signing of a treaty or a protocol will magically lead to peace at the national or regional level. Yes, this peace and war are so complex. Like Abdullah says, it's a devouring wolf. Yeah, it's, we can use so many different words to describe war and peace. But our attitude towards the United Nations and the state of the world is both realistic but hopeful. Says despite the obvious shortcomings of the United Nations, the more than 200 declarations and conventions adopted by that organization, even when governments have not been enthusiastic in their commitment, have given ordinary people a sense of lease on life. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we can read on, but just in the interest of time, I'll stop it. It's true, it has given us a sense of a lease on life. For the Baha'is alone, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been the reason why the issue of the Baha'is of Iran and Yemen and others has been so prominent, and the UN has played a huge role in highlighting the issue of the human rights abuses against the Baha'is in Iran, and that has caused to take action as well, right? Lastly, thinking about that big question in terms of how do we evoke that inner state, both internationally and nationally. This is from Abdul Baha from the Tablet to the Hague. It's quoted also in the 18th of January 2019 message. It says, "Today, the benefits of universal peace are recognized amongst the people, and likewise the harmful effects of war are clear and manifest to all. But in this matter, knowledge alone is far from sufficient. A power of implementation is needed to establish it throughout the world. It is our firm belief," he continued, "that the power of implementation in this great endeavor is the penetrating influence of the Word of God and the confirmations of the Holy Spirit." So we know that religion, this is the role of religion that Max was mentioning, that the House mentions, that the Word of God and this revelation of Baha'u'llah is that power of implementation that is able to take humanity from its state that it's currently in now, right, towards an age of permanent peace, right, that we're looking for. It's not about knowledge and knowing more. We know, we're overwhelmed. Max mentioned we're overwhelmed by how much we know about war and peace, right? Yeah. So thank you very much.